It is,
I-
it is 4 o'clock, so I'd like to go ahead and call the meeting to order. And we'll start off with our Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Meeting guidelines, safety protocols doesn't really apply, but just for folks know, the meeting is open to the public and is being recorded. With that, there is no public comment regarding this meeting, as it's this meeting's a workshop. So, and moving on to our vision and mission statement, our vision. Our community inspires and prepares each student to thrive. And our mission, in connection with our community, the Squam School District empowers staff to inspire hope and provide flexible, innovative learning opportunities in a safe and respectful environment so each student thrives. And our acknowledgement of the land we stand on. Director Stoffer, would you like to read our land acknowledgement?
Yes, thank you. I was adjusting the blind there when the Squam School District administrative and school buildings sit on the ancestral land of the Squam people. While the Squam traditionally come from one nation, history has led to the formation of 3 sovereign Squam tribal governments. The Lower Elwha Squam tribe, which is located in Port Angeles, the Jamestown Squam tribe, which is located here in Squam, and then the Port Gamble Squam tribe, which is located in Kingston, Washington. The district's primary partnership is with the Jamestown Squam tribe. Today, the tribe and district share a partnership that includes official consultation on program and funding changes that may directly affect American Indian and Alaskan Native students, as well as holistic service planning for students to remain successful in their educational journeys.
Thank you, Director Stoffer. And that brings us to 2.01, our presentation. And I believe we are going to pass it directly over to Monica to take the reins on this. Monica, welcome.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Eric. Greg
Or
Lynch
Greg,
here.
maybe.
That's okay, no worries. Greg
Yeah.
Lynch here, the ESD Superintendent. I know many of you. We've talked over some years, and Eric and I had talked a lot, it seems, over the last year or so. So I'm here to help. For those of you who know, I've been in the job now for, I don't know, 9 or 10 years. And before that, I was over in Central Kitsap for almost as many years as the school district superintendent there. Monica Hunsaker, who Eric mentioned, is the assistant superintendent for business and finance here at the ESD. For those of you that may know Monica, she's been basically the lead finance person at Central Kitsap and also North Kitsap. So she's got lots of experience in the area that we're going to talk about tonight. My role, just so you know, is to really help school districts out in a number of things. Tonight, we're going to talk about finance. And for maybe the newer board members, or just a refresher for those who've been around for some time, we have a statutory responsibility in our ESD to review all school districts' budgets before they go in, and it happens in the summer. You may know that. And so we do that to meet our statutory obligations, but also to help in any way that we can. I've got no directive authority over school districts, and neither does Monica, around anything that's got to do with school district business, but we're really here as a resource. We've had to be involved over the years, just a little bit more background around getting a little bit more deeply involved with school finance. And we also have a statutory responsibility. And fortunately, we've had a couple of near misses over the years since I've been here, but we have not had to take over school district finances. And I make that point because, generally speaking, throughout the region, districts are in pretty good shape with managing their finances. But if a district becomes insolvent for whatever reason, and that's certainly not the case with Squam, but if that ever would happen, and we've had a couple near misses, then the OESD board, along with myself as the superintendent and Monica, actually have got an obligation to basically take over the finances of the school district. And that happens if the school district becomes insolvent. It's a long process. It doesn't happen overnight, but it is there in statute. And again, Squam's not anywhere close to that, but I just mentioned that as a reason for why we get involved in finances, and we prefer to get involved in up front, as opposed to when we get to a point where, if that ever had to happen, we've got some bigger problems. And again, that's not certainly the case in Squam. So what we prepared with information from Darlene and Joan over the last couple of weeks is a typical presentation that we would give if we were inside a school district about where we are with the district's finances. So, you know, my point for mentioning that is that we have gotten a lot of information from Squam, but our information is only as good as the information that's provided to us. And so I'm certainly not here, and Monica's not here to direct you or tell you what to do. We've gotten information, we've taken a look at it, we've formed basically some opinions based upon the information that we have. And so what you're going to see tonight is basically a layout of that information with respect to where we think you are right now and where you're headed. So I'm going to turn it over to Monica. I'll be back at the end of the presentation. I would encourage questions along the way. Don't hesitate to stop Monica or me when we're providing the presentation. And if you got questions, please, we're small enough, you know, raise your hand, speak up, and we'll try to address those issues as they come up. Joan, yeah, I don't know if you have anything else that you want to add at this point before we get started, but I'm going to defer to you first and then back on over to Monica. And you're on mute, Joan.
Sorry, thank you for asking, but no, I don't have anything to add right now. I'm just all ears for the presentation, and we're ready to go, I think.
Okay, great, Joan. So Monica, you're on.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to be at your board meeting tonight. I'm going to walk through. I do believe you got this presentation ahead of time. And like Greg said, if you want to stop me, questions, I'll pause after each slide too. But you can definitely just jump in and ask me a question as well. In addition to reviewing your budget that Greg mentioned, we also review the year-end financials and review those and give feedback. So we become very familiar with our school district budgets in our region. This is the short agenda. Just want to give you some background, which you probably already know, some history, enrollment, and fund balance. Then we'll take a look at your current budget. You're living in 21-22 right now, but planning for 22-23. And then just kind of some next steps or some unknowns, as I like to call them. Your enrollment here, the high mark was in 17-18 of almost 2,800 kids, and you lost, and this is very typical across the state during COVID. In 2021, you see the dip, because 19-20 you got to keep claiming your enrollment through the when the pandemic started, and then 2021 is when districts across the state saw a decline. You did get some of that back, but not near where you were at before. And for 22-23, the estimate is a slight decline in enrollment as well. Your fund balance, I pay very close attention to the fund balances at the year end. I actually present them to our ESD board of directors. I do a review of all the districts in our region and kind of give that to our board, so they're aware of where our districts are at with their fund balances, their expenditures, their revenues, and so forth. Your fund balance is at a low point as far as percent of expenditures. Value-wise, it's not at the lowest dollar value, but it is at your lowest percent it has ever been of expenditures. You also have the lowest percent of expenditures in our region. And believe it or not, I did flag it at year end going, oh, it was a worry or a concern of mine when I see such a dip. The state average as fund balance as a percent of expenditures is 14.7%. and you are sitting at about 4.89 when you wrapped up 2021. So bringing the fund balance down further for Squam School District is going to cause cash flow issues for you. One thing that your business manager, Darlene, does is a cash flow analysis, very common among districts because the timing of the revenue that you receive is different each month. And then your taxes, you only collect twice a year. So bringing it down any further than it is now is going to make it very difficult for you to maintain an adequate cash flow to cover your expenses. Usually that would happen in about December. That's when we start to see that problem with districts that have a low fund balance, that they can't cover those expenses in December, January timeframe. Is there any questions about fund balance? Enrollment? Okay. I usually talk really fast, so I'm trying to talk slower. So ESSER funding. ESSER funding is one-time funding. I like to remind people of that all the time, and I'm sure you're already aware. Districts received an influx of this funding due to COVID, and it started with ESSER 1, then there was ESSER 2, and now there's ESSER 3. And inside of ESSER 3, it's split. So a portion of that ESSER 3 funding has to be spent on learning recovery, and it's very specific. For Squam School District, the only expenditures that were made in 2021 were $481,000. That's that blue box. Your total funding is $9.4 million. So in the current 21-22 school year, though, you are spending ESSER. This is what was year-to-date plus encumbrance. And an encumbrance means that it's already earmarked and going to be spent. So that's about $2.28 million that is currently being projected to be spent in ESSER in 21-22. Which would bring your total expenditures of ESSER to 2.7 million, leaving you 6.7 million still. ESSER 1 has all of these have a time frame too. ESSER 1 has to be spent by the end of this year, so September 2022. And I know there is a plan to spend that 217,000, and we'll get into that in another slide here too as well. Is there any questions on the ESSER? So here's your current budget. And here's what I did with Darlene. I asked for data, but I also have access to all of your data. I have access to your financial system. I can run reports and I have full access. So I asked her for some things, but I said, I don't want you to tell me what you're projecting because I want to do it. And then I want you to tell me, and we're going to compare. Well, we did that. And guess what? We were very close, within about, I think it was about 30,000 difference. So what Darlene was projecting and then what I ran, we came together, and that's how close it was. That's always a good sign. Because when it's way off, we have to really dig through and question, why do you project so differently than me, or why, maybe I'm wrong, whatnot. So in the current 21-22, your expenditures will exceed your revenue by about, I always round up, so about 1.8 million. If you let that happen, your fund balance is going to be 223,000, and then you wouldn't be able to make payroll. It's a major cash flow issue, so we know that can't happen. So the recommendation that I'm providing is that you find allowable expenses for ESSER and move that 1.8 million of expenses into an ESSER claim. Now, I've talked to Darlene, I've talked to Joan, and I know that there are expenses that can be found that are allowable, that can be moved to ESSER to do that. So if you do that, this is what will happen. Your deficit was 1.8, but you move qualifying ESSER expenditures. Your net result is instead of deficit spending, you might have a little net surplus of 8,000. That'll also bring your ESSER expenditures from that 2.7 million total to 4 million. Now, this number is very important, the 4 million, because whatever you're spending in that 4 million, you're going to need to be prepared to cut it all, because this is one-time funding. So I always express caution. Whatever you're moving in there is probably what you're going to cut down the road. And that's a big number, 4 million. Here's what 22-23 budget is looking like. But before I go into this, was there any questions about the 21-22? I'm not sure if it's a good sign when there's no questions or not, but I'll keep going then.
Monica, I do have a question about 2021, or I'm sorry, 21-22 school year. I remember that we did have funds allocated in the budget that we approved in August that were, but my understanding is because it was, I think, under the line of under expenses and revenue, that it was federal, and I assumed that that was a significant chunk was ESSER in that budget. So can you confirm if this is, when you're making the recommendation, I think the 1.8 million, is that in addition to what's already been budgeted, or is that inclusive of that number?
So one thing about budget, and we advise our districts too, is most districts budgeted expending all of their ESSER. So they budgeted all the revenue and budgeted all the expenses. It doesn't mean that they were going to necessarily expense it all, but they budgeted it. So currently what's in your system for Squam is you're spending about that $2.2 million. And I'm recommending that in addition to that 2.2 that you're currently set to spend on ESSER, you move another 1.8 million, which would bring the total ESSER expenditures for 21-22 to a little over 4 million. And then that will leave you another chunk of ESSER, which we'll get to.
Okay, thank you.
So here's 22-23. If Squam moves the 1.8 million of allowable qualifying expenses, that's very important, okay? You're going to start this 22-23 school year with that little surplus, right? And what I like to do, sometimes this confuses people. So I'm going to assume that all of your expenditures are what they are, and all of your revenue is what it is for 21-22, and then we're going to roll it forward. And what is going to change? So that's what this slide is. What's changing for 22-23? You're going to get some additional apportionment. Apportionment is your state funding, or your, I always say it's your paycheck. And there's several reasons for that. One reason is the IPD increase. And then there's some MSOC increases, and MSOC is your material, supplies, and operating costs. I ran the numbers for your apportionment as flat enrollment, and that's an important factor. So if any of you were to ever go onto OSPI's website, you'll actually see these numbers on their website. They have a tool that people can look at. So your apportionment increases by a little under 1.3 million. And then there's some other categories in there. And I know there's a lot of acronyms. So SEL is social emotional learning. That's new funding for 22-23, and it's targeted funding. Typically apportionment comes in and you can spend it how you choose, correct? But this, you have to spend it on social emotional learning staffing. And there's a compliance piece to that. CTE or Career Tech Ed, you'll be receiving additional funds. It's categorical, and I call it categorical, meaning the reason I'm calling these out separately is you have to spend them in that area. TBIP is transitional bilingual. Highly capable is the high cap. LAP is your learning assistance program. And then there's special education. So those are all increases to your funding for next year. However, Squam is budgeting a slight enrollment decrease. And so you'll lose some of that revenue because of that decline. And that'll be about $407,000 that you'll lose. So if your enrollment does come at a higher number, you would actually, that would be a lower decline. Or if your enrollment comes higher than it is in 21, 22, then you'll see additional revenue. You're also going to see a little more in your levy collection. And then that's all the money side, the revenue changes, right? And it's a plus, which is a good thing. But then there's always expenditure changes. Fixed costs, utilities, insurance, legal. And then there's a salary and benefit cost. But then there's a saving in some expenditures, which is your attrition of staff. And I think I'm looking at this and I have the old PowerPoint. So, because these are not the correct numbers because we've had more attrition in staff. So, the deficit or surplus changes, and I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a second and pull up the correct PowerPoint. So I apologize. While I do that, is there anybody else that's has any questions?
Yeah, so while Monica's looking for that one slide that's got the updated numbers on the attrition of staff, I think the thing that I think about, and I've done this a gazillion times, is that there's a lot of variables that we're dealing with right now. And so you got to keep in mind these are projections. And when you think about enrollment, you think about the ups and downs that we've had the last couple of years. It's been pretty significant when you're losing 300 kiddos. And so that could make all the difference in the world when we get to the fall. And so the staff attrition at this point is the other major variable that you would hope it's getting resolved here pretty quickly, which is why we're talking tonight, because you've got to have your certificated staff under contract here by the 15th of May, right? I mean, we're coming up on that date pretty quickly. And so usually for the certificated staff, we've got a pretty good idea at this point in time where that lies. And so I just caution everybody as you take a look at these slides, there's just a lot of variability that could change pretty significantly the numbers by the time we get to what actually is expended here later on. So go ahead, Monica, let's go ahead and take a look at that one slide.
And he's right. And that's why the number has changed, because originally it was lower for the attrition of staff. And then you received as a district some other resignations and changes. And then the other thing that I had changed from that was the legal. We got more of a better number of what your increased legal expenses could be. So here is the correct numbers. No, if we do all of these things, then your deficit would be 66,000 and you'd end 22-23 with a 1.9 fund balance. Now, this also assumes that you're continuing to spend 4 million of ESSER in 22-23, and you will have enough to do that. But that will be the last year that you will be able to do that. So when you go into 23-24, and I'll go to the next slide, you're going to have to cut $4 million. So here's that ESSER. And you can see it's estimating that you're going to spend just over 4 million or 4.1, because I like to round up, in 22-23. You can use it as a bridge, so you don't have to make that big of reductions going into 22-23, but you will have to make the reductions going into 23-24. And so really, if you can, my recommendation is that you reduce or cut from your budget now anything you can, because 4 million is a really big number. It's 10% of your budget. Now, if you do that, that'll leave you about 813,000 of ESSER left, which I think we'll talk about in here in a second, what that could potentially be. So here's your unknowns. I mentioned it before, enrollment. If it comes in higher, great. That means you have more revenue. If it comes in lower than we project, that's going to bring down your fund balance further unless you can make quick adjustments. But by then you already have all your staffing, and that's difficult. So that's another reason too, that if you can make any reductions, make them now. Changes in salary and benefits from budget. A budget is a budget. I always say a budget is only good the day you make it. The next day it's changed. It's a plan, right? Because it's just like at home. You make a plan and then something happens. Your stove breaks. Something happens. So salary and benefits, you could end up, I'm sure, you know, you have positions, somebody leaves and somebody else comes back in. They might come in at a lower pay scale. That'll save you some money from your budget. They might come in at a higher pay scale. That'll take, you know, that will not save you money and end up, you'll be spending more than you budgeted. So that's very typical. You know, a budget is a plan. Emergent capital expenses. And I know one that you have. Fortunately, you have your capital levy, and you'll start collecting that in 22, 23. But I do know that you have an emergent capital expense in your transportation department. The legal that I mentioned, you all are aware of your legal expenses. They have far exceeded your budget in this year. And it's my understanding that will continue. Another unknown is regionalization. Currently, you do get regionalization, but that is set to sunset. Basically, they're going to review it. And any updates or changes will be going into 23, 24. So what does that look like? Maybe you're going to get a higher regionalization. Maybe you're going to get a lower. Don't know. So it's just an unknown. Is there any questions about the unknowns? You all are so quiet because that was all I had.
Yeah, so let me just kind of come back around again and put a bow on some key points. ESSER has been a good thing for many of our school districts, and it's really helped cover some expenses as a result of COVID, which is what ESSER was for. But as Monica talked about, you know, we're talking about a pretty good chunk of money, $9 million, but it's all one-time money. And so bottom line, and you've heard it a couple of times, you're looking at about a $4 million deficit that's probably going to come to roost not later than 23, 24. And so, you know, Monica's point, which I totally support, is any sort of reductions that you can do now will reduce those reductions later on. And so as we take a look at your programs and what you could potentially cut, everybody knows that about 8% of your expenditures are generally staff costs. And so what I'm thinking of, and I'm sure what you're all thinking of, is that if you're in a position to cut now, or if you have to wait 12 months from now, what you're likely looking at is a pretty significant reduction in staff with a $4 million deficit. That's a big chunk. And because 80% of what we do goes into the personnel, you got to be thinking around, okay, what does that look like? You know, do you take a little bit now? You take a little bit later on? The fact of the matter is that you're going to be left with some pretty difficult decisions sometime in the next 12 months or so. And so what I would encourage you to do as you finalize this budget is really look hard at any new expenditures, and whether or not they're personnel cost or whether or not they're program or whatever. The question is, do you really need those additions at this point, recognizing you may have to come back around, you know, in 12 months from now and make some reductions. So, you know, what we stopped a couple of seconds ago was questions, and this may be a good time for questions or just general discussion. Lots of information in a short amount of time. The bottom line is I'm personally validating the numbers that we showed you based upon some pretty intensive work. And as Monica said in the beginning, you know, she did some independent work because we did not want to be influenced by the work that you had already done. And having Monica's basically projections and Darlene's projections be within about $30,000 is a pretty good sign that at least you're on track, that you know what you've got and you know what you don't have here in another year or so. So, you know, with that, Eric, I maybe turn it back on over to you if you want to get questions from board members or discussion, whatever you want to do.
I do want to mention one thing, and it probably won't make you feel better, but I'm currently in Spokane at a regional conference with the business officials across the state. You are not alone. You are not alone in these reductions. Everybody I have talked to and networked with today is in the same boat or going to be in that boat because of this money and using it. Obviously, there comes a time when you have to make the reductions. And there's large numbers out there that I'm hearing, and it is because of this ESSER one-time funding. So you're not alone. I know it doesn't make it feel any better, but I just want you to know that this is happening across the state.
And I appreciate Monica's emphasis on that, because I will tell you it's happening in our region pretty significantly. And again, some school districts have got to tighten their belt right away. Every school district in our region is going to be faced with a similar situation here in the next 12 months. And so it is important to know that you're not alone. This doesn't have to do with mismanagement. It doesn't have to do with, making some bad decisions along the way. It's just the reality of what's happened with COVID and federal funds and a declining enrollment on the average across the state of 4%. And quite frankly, we don't know if we're going to see a recovery in enrollment. And so that's really a big part of that variability that I talked about, where we just don't know. We won't know until next fall. So Eric, back on over to you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I'll open it up to the rest of the board first. If anyone wants to general questions or discussion. Director Alverson, thank you. Nice to see you.
I made it. Yeah, this is really important, and it is very sobering. I just think about it seems like there are three arenas that are right there in front of us, which are the cost of staff, the cost of litigation, and then the dropping enrollment. And certainly sounds like we have to do some pretty intensive work on how to bring that around. My question about enrollment is just a question about how that projection is calculated, and also then for the board, so just a question about how we might address that decline and reaching out to students or finding out, doing some sort of data collection as to what became of them to see. I know that won't solve our deficit by any means, but at least that's one thing besides cutting positions that we could think about doing. So my question is about the projections, just exactly how those are calculated, and also how we can try to redress that decline in enrollment.
Yeah, so Monica will give you a very good response on the calculations for enrollment. Before she tells you that, though, just in this, I'm going to give you my perspective. Enrollment isn't the easiest thing to project, but it's a lot easier to project when you don't have 2 years worth of COVID and you have declining enrollment because people don't want to put parents don't want to put the kids in a virtual environment, okay, which contributed to this 4% drop. And so it's a little bit of a science, and it's a little bit of best guess. We're going back pre-COVID, okay, and the assumption is, you got two assumptions you got to make in the fall. Number one, is COVID really in retreat? And if it is, the numbers that we had pre-COVID, right, which is going to be part of that calculation, what that number was pre-COVID, is going to be pretty significant as you budget your enrollment for next year with the assumption that we're going to be back to normal. If we're not back to normal, we're in the same thing that we've been in the last 2 years, that assumption may not hold true. And we could look more like 4% decrease than we did 2 or 3 years ago. And so when we talk about variability, that's part of the problem right now. And so we're making some bold assumptions. So Monica, you can cover with what I left off, but those are the big ideas for enrollment projection.
Thank you.
I know Darlene is on too, so I don't know, Darlene, if you want to chime in as well, but really the enrollment is a roll up based on historical changes between grade levels. And then, so what you do is basically, and you can always tell when you're going to hit a decline too, because if your outgoing 12th graders is a larger number than your incoming kindergarten, that's when you know that you're going to be having some decline, unless you typically see an influx of kindergartners. So basically you roll up all the grades, first goes to second, and then you look back historically and see that change. Like typically 10th to 11th grade goes down. The reason why, a lot of them are going to running start, and 11th to 12th also goes down. So it's not a straight roll up. So it's adjusted for that historical change between grade levels, which is different for every district. Some might have a private school nearby that starts in the 4th grade, and they'll see a drop in 4th grade. So there's just variability there. And like Greg said, it is a projection. Hopefully it'll come in higher. That's what we always hope, districts across the state. I don't know if you want to add anything, Darlene.
I would agree that that is what I did. I dropped off the outgoing 12th graders, projection of kindergartners coming in, and then looked at those numbers, and then also looked historically at like month to month and what it was, you know, at certain times of the year, month by month. And then we could see that even from last month to this month, we had almost a 10 FTE drop from April to May. So it causes us to be more cautious when we're projecting our enrollment for this next year, because we just don't know. We're just not increasing in our enrollment yet.
Yeah, and we're seeing the other thing that I would say about enrollment, and we're seeing it's different between school districts, but for those school districts that have got good virtual programs, there's some parents and kids that are sold on virtual. That's certainly not the majority. But if you go down that ALE route, you know, your apportionment starts to change. And so your money's different at that point. And so that's the other thing, is we normalize how many students will we see, because virtual programs matured at a rate that we didn't think that they would mature before COVID, but by necessity they had to. And some parents are more attracted because they're probably 5 years down the road more mature than they would have been without COVID. And it will impact enrollment in a lot of school districts.
It's like Superintendent Zook, do you have something to add as well?
Yes, I was just going to speak to Marin's question about have we identified where the students are, and are we doing anything to get them back? And we did do an analysis of best we could of what we could gather about where our students went, and the majority of them that left indicated that they are homeschooling. And while we know that, we are prohibited from reaching out to homeschoolers to try to get them to re-enroll. It's an RCW. So those, unless people do it voluntarily, we have no ability to reach people. We are doing a lot right now to plan for initiatives for kindergarten enrollment, generic, you know, come back to school, please enroll, enrollment's open. So we're doing those things, but we cannot directly target our homeschoolers and invite them back. So I just wanted everybody to be on the same page on that.
Thank you. Director Stoffel?
Yes, thank you. And I was wondering if we could see a snapshot of the decline per grade level, because that helps me process it on when I see that, okay, the kindergartners first and second are at a decline. It resonates with me because a lot of my personal belief is that folks just stayed home, or they kept their kids home during COVID, and maybe in the fall they'll come back. But being able to see that, and I think of transitional kindergarten programs. I also think of dual credit college and the high school programs, which, you know, is as opposed to Running Start. Though Running Start is a great program, but with college and the high school, we do keep the students in our buildings, and we get that full funding. It's just some reprogramming. At one time in Squam, we went back and we looked at the birth rates in our hospitals in our zones to get a projection of what that kindergarten class would be. And I I remember back when working on levies and bonds that we had a time period where we saw that, yeah, we're going to have a lower kindergarten class because the birth rates were lower at OMC in Jefferson County Hospital at the time. So I know there's a lot of trying to figure out the prediction because there's so many unknowns in this, and I know that at times when we open the doors in August, then that's when everybody shows up, and then we're trying to find space for them. A few years ago, when if we hadn't had the kindergarten pods that we were able to put in over at Grey Wolf, we were at a facility crisis of where we're going to put and we still at times running that and having the space and so forth. So that's just some thoughts running in my mind right now. Thank you.
Director Jeffries.
Yeah. Well, first of all, my bias is to we're not going to go back to normal. I think we need to assume our enrollment is going to stay low. I hope we get a big influx of kids that does give us the problems that do give us the problem that Director Stauffer talked about, like where are we going to put them? But to hope for that with our fingers crossed, I think would be a huge mistake. I kind of look at the ESSER funds and what we need to do with the budget is, I know I'm the old man on the board, so I'm going to talk about suspenders and belts. ESSER is like suspenders to hold my pants up. But at some point, I'm going to need to put on that belt and maybe even make a few more holes in the belt so I can really tighten it up really, really tight. Because, I just can't, we are on a time deadline over the next 2 years where this money is going to disappear. I think we have to have our priorities. Personally, I think everything is on the table, but obviously the board has spoken that priorities is on the people that work for us, our staff, and put prime importance on them. But I think Monica, mentioned that, we may have attrition and we just may not be able to refill those positions. And that going to be some tough decisions. I know the board in general, we don't like to say the word RIF. And it really hits me in the gut. The last time we had to vote a RIF in, that hit me. But that's unfortunately on the table. So I think everything's on there. And plus the larger context, Monica mentioned that we're not the only school district, and Greg mentioned it, that this area is, everybody's going to be facing something here in the next couple of years. But the larger context of it, I work with a Facebook group and I can see like restaurants. One of the local favorites just announced they're going to be closed on Monday and Tuesday because they can't staff Monday and Tuesday. Now I'm guessing, I don't know for sure, that they can't find cooks. And cooks can't work 7 days a week without a break. We may be in that position where we are going to have to cut programs because we just don't have the right people in place, or the people that are in place just can't take on any more work, can't cover another period for teachers. But I think, we're going to have to make some real hard decisions in collaboration with the staff, and the community really needs to hear from us and the district to understand what's going on. A $4 million cut is huge. And that's what we're facing over the next 2 years. And I think we need to base everything we do on that reality. We do what we can this school year. And I noticed that Regan is on board and listening to us, and then she'll come in July, and we'll need to continue to look at what we're doing in 21, 22 and get ready for 23, 24 and really start looking at 24, 25 because we got some serious thinking to do with very little time to do it. So I appreciate all the efforts that the district has made and really appreciate ESD coming in and helping us out, and nothing else, validating that what we're hearing and what we're seeing is what it really is. So I'm ready. I mean, I don't know what, don't have an answer. I mean, I'm ready to roll up my sleeves and go to work on this and do what we can. And we're just going to have to make some really, really hard choices with the help and support of the staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Jeffries. Yeah, I just want to add from me that I really appreciate the recommendation that does paint the picture as it is, but does allow, the recommendation does allow for us to use ESSER funds as sort of a bridge, because when I think about yes, I can appreciate the enrollment situation that we have, but I also can appreciate the student needs that are out there, and considering, you know, just social, emotional, and academic needs of where students are right now. Having that bridge, using those funds, does allow us to consider potentially those staff members that are closest to the students, how we can still fill those student needs. And so I think that does give us some flexibility over the next year potentially. I do appreciate the recommendation though about not wanting to make all of those cuts at once, and I think that will be certainly a consideration as we move forward. But for us to use those funds as a bridge so that we can make sure that we're still providing our students with everything they need over this school year, and then we can, as things get closer to May 15th of next school year, we'll have to take a really solid look at do we have anticipated attrition, or actually hopefully we'll take a look at that much sooner than May 15th, of course, and try to look at what needs to be done between now and then. So I just appreciate that. Director Halverson, and I'm gonna then we have Regan also. So
I'm just going to be brief here. I just wanted to appreciate Larry's comment about the word collaboration, that in the face of all of this, that is super important that we all know that we're all in the same team and that we have to work together, and we have to make this a group effort. And by that, I mean the entire district coming together to work this through.
thank you. Regan.
Hi there. I'm sorry, my camera's off. I cannot get it to come back on. So, okay, here we go. I did want to talk about, I think the number that you showed, Monica, for attrition this year was 760,000-ish. And if we play that out over a series of 3 years, we're not getting to 4 million. So I would just want to say that I'm not sure where the brainstorming is around what we might be looking at sooner rather than later. But I guess I'm just contemplating right now that it is a journey that has to happen with rapidity. You know, it's got to be fast because ESSER's gone. And so when we're dedicating this much money of ESSER as a bridge, do recognize that the reason for the ESSER money may not be realized, because that may be specialty programs or emphasis in areas that we may not have, that we're not going to be able to implement because we're using it as a bridge instead. So I just would like to think about a 3-year plan that could really get to 4 million. and just put that out there. And then in a second comment regarding the talk about a census for enrollment, I'm actually in the last stage of an enrollment census, and it's taken 2 years. And the reason for that is housing starts. I know that in Squam right now, you are looking at housing starts, and I would just want to consider what housing looks like. Are we looking at housing for an older group, or is it really family-based housing? Because I think that's going to affect what we can count on next for enrollment. And then I think the check on birth rates makes a lot of sense right now.
One thing that I can speak to a little bit that I think, and certainly Monica or Darlene or Greg can jump in here too, but one aspect with the attrition that, again, not that it's a firm thing by any means, it's still an unknown, but I think that there is some thought out there that because we're at this 5-year mark that just from McCleary rolling out that dramatically changed a lot of folks' salaries, there might be an uptick in attrition at that 5-year mark, because that dramatically impacts what the essentially it takes your average highest 5 years of salary, is my understanding, and at the end of next year will be that 5-year mark, if I'm not mistaken. Again, it's not a sure thing, but it's potentially something. Our staff, similar to a lot of districts, have a significant portion of the staff that are at that higher end of the salary schedule, and so that it might benefit us in that regard. That percentage might increase, but not a sure thing. And Superintendent Zook, if you want to.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to speak to Regan's question about housing. We've been trying to, I've talked with the city and the county about what we know at this point. And while there are some plans, they're pushed out to be realized, even the smaller developments, really about over a 5-year period or so. And so I don't think in the near future that we're going to see a huge influx of like affordable housing or something. What is coming in, like the big development, the Lavender Farms, is a 55 plus. And while the other communities, the 2 plans that I know about, one in the city and one in the county, are not age restricted, they are just several years out from being realized. And so, and beyond that, I don't claim to be the expert on influx, but that's what I know at this point. So anyway, thank you.
Director Johnson.
Thank you first for the presentation. It was very helpful, and it was a good introduction for people who aren't really familiar with how the ESSER funding works, and it's so it was very helpful to me, and I appreciate it. And I kind of want to piggyback off of what Megan said regarding how the attrition is maybe going to factor in going forward, because it seems like even if we do have attrition, the question of whether we lose positions as a result of RIF or attrition, you still have the problem that you're losing people in classrooms. And how do we address the fact that how we keep our class size reasonable, how we make sure that we're allocating our staffing to meet the needs of the age distribution that we have in the schools and that kind of thing. So obviously it's preferable to have a person leave voluntarily than to leave involuntarily. But it still seems like, as you were saying, Regan, $4 million is just a huge number of salaries, or it just reflects a huge adjustment for for everybody to make. And it seems like that's something we're going to really have to, as Maren said, try to work together on to make sure that we are patching all the holes and making sure that all the needs are being met. So, and it makes me really pleased to see that at least we are thinking proactively, and we are thinking, we really need to get on this going forward. So it's not everybody doesn't feel surprised or, doesn't feel prepared as we start the next budget cycle and are trying to address these issues. So thank you.
Director Stauffer?
Yes, I was wondering if we've thought about surveying the daycare providers throughout the area. I know that during the heat of COVID, there was not enough daycare providers and facilities and we were actually at a crisis here across the county. But where are those daycare providers, those facilities? I know we have one private school facility that transitions to the high school. And then we have 3 faith-based in our area. One's based out of Port Angeles, and then they stop at 8th grade, and then they come over typically come to either Port Angeles or Squam High School. And then every Wednesday, there's a whole bunch of little kids running around Carrie Blake Park for soccer. And probably some, are homeschool, but can we reach in to that parent group and ask? I mean, because they start at, they got 4-year-olds running around out there kicking the ball around. They're there every Wednesday evening. And then the youth baseball too, which is on the weekends. And then for housing, there is a development going in out here to the east of me on West Quimby Road, and it's projected for 80 houses in a 2-year time frame. That's the phase 1, and then they'll be moving into phase 2 and phase 3, and those are open. There's not it's a family style, but I think the pricing on them is still pretty high type thing. Well, thank you again. I thank ESD for their help in that, and I appreciate Maren's words there and Larry's on the collaboration, because it is going to take all of us, all the buildings, everybody discussing these items. So thank you.
Director Jeffries?
Yeah, I appreciate too that getting the collaboration going and some of the community suggestions that Director Stauffer mentioned and some others. It's important to have them on our playlist. And of course, it sounds like there may be some strings and limitations on who we can do that and how we can do that. But I think we, as a community, need to start making that effort. But it isn't probably going to directly help us for this next school year, or hopefully we would start seeing positive benefits for the 23-24 school year in enrollment increasing. But you're right now the housing, a lot of it is for older populations, and it expensive. I don't know if home pricing in Squam area has been pricing a lot of people out of the home market, and there's no place to, or very few places to rent. So it's very difficult. I would ask, let's see, coming up May 15th, we have to do something by May 15th to certified staffing. And then after that, we need to, I don't know what the timeline is, so I'm a little bit Rusty on that I need clarification, the timeline on getting how we're going to start the school year off with all the belt tightening in place. It sounds to me like we're going to start that here in May and June, and then we'll continue it on in July when Superintendent Riggins comes on board. Conflated when Regan comes on board, Superintendent Nichols. I have to get used to saying that. I'm excited about it, but we're going to hit the ground in July with some real tough decisions having already been made or new decisions to be made. So as a board question, and the district, I know that final budget isn't due till later on in the year, but we need to make those decisions pretty quickly. So what kind of timeline are we looking at where we're going to have to make the hard choices of that belt tightening that I mentioned? How soon?
Greg, dude, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, it's interesting Larry asked that question, because I was going to make a couple of comments, and I make these comments because I've been unfortunately down this road before as a district superintendent in this exact same position at this time. And so the good news is, by all counts, you've hired a great incoming superintendent in terms of Regan. That's good news. The not so good news is she's going to be left with you, the board, on the unenviable task of having to do some pretty significant reductions pretty quickly. It's a hard way to step into a community when you're saying that you got to make reductions, right? That's a hard way to start. But the sooner, Larry, your point that you have a plan to be able to go down that path, the better you'll be. And so Eric had mentioned 5 minutes ago around this time, a year from now. And my experience with this, and something to think about, is the conversations really need to start this summer. And so when you talk about a $4 million reduction in where we are right now in the budget process, you're not going to be able to do much between now and the start of the new school year. I mean, that's just a reality. And with a $4 million deficit that you're facing long term, the only way you're going to be able to do those sorts of reductions is you're going to have the community with you, and they're going to have to be informed and part of the process. And so there's some models out there that I've certainly used, that Monica's familiar with, to really start thinking about how you engage the community early on, and having the board think about how you decide what your most important priorities are. And you do that, through a community input process. And that really has to start this summer, fall, because it's going to take you through the fall into the new year to gather that data, to do the analysis, to decide what that preliminary budget is going to start to look like, probably as soon as next January or February. So we talk about this May 15th deadline. And in fact, when you talk about working with a union, which is a really important part of what we're talking about, that discussion really has to happen way before May. That discussion has to happen like the first of the year, because at some point people are going to lose their jobs, and you can't tell them in May that they're going to lose the job. And so you've got a requirement in April to put out a program, basically memorandum, that says here's how you're going to make the reductions, and inevitably is going to be involving the staff. And again, those conversations have to have months before that. So really, Larry, my point is that you're about right there now with Regan coming in to have a bigger strategy around how you collect community input, how do you have the conversations, and then really in the fall, you got to come to some sort of an agreement collaboratively. And I heard that term. What are your top 5 or 6 priorities? I think the reason why that's important, and this is where it's really an inevitable position for the board and the superintendent, no matter what reductions you make, you're going to upset a lot of people. People will be upset. And the best friend that you have in the process is asking for input early on, asking the right questions, telling the story over and over again, and then having a really good rationale as to why you're going to make those reductions and whatever they look like. And so you're talking about a year's process. And so I've been down this road before. I know how it feels. And it's going to take a couple of years to get there. And I think it was, maybe Marion had said early on, the fact that you can't, maybe it was Patrice, you can't, when you take a look at the amount of money that you're talking about, this is something that you can't just do in one fell swoop. You may be forced to, because you've got to have, you got to maintain a fund balance and you got to have cash flow. And so I think it's a lot bigger issue beyond the study section tonight and the near-term problem. It's really that strategy that's going to get you to the next step. And, Regan, I'm glad you're joining us, but I'm also, I'm feeling what you're feeling probably at this point. You're up for the challenge, I'm sure. But that's part of a summer conversation, is to really get the right people and to lay out the strategy. So Eric, that's what I wanted to share. It may be seeming like a blinding flash of the obvious, but this work ahead is not for the faint of heart. But you're not going to do it without the community and without the staff together. And so that's really the job one, is how do you get that input? And so anyway, that's what I wanted to add. So thank you.
Director Alverson.
I really appreciate that approach with bringing stakeholders together to brainstorm and make this a community effort. And I think that's really important. I'm going to ask something that may seem extremely naive, and I'll just blame being a new board member on it completely. But we're talking about cuts because our bottom line looks terrible. What about how we raise money? How do we bring money in? Because obviously that's the other side of the coin, so to speak, right? And I know we have monies that are coming our way, et cetera, but is that something we also need to brainstorm about in terms of funding?
How active is the Squam Educational Foundation?
Hi, this is Director Jeffries. I work with the Squam Educational Foundation. Basically, what they do, first of all, they administer endowment scholarships, and they do not actively raise money for scholarships for kids. They do have money that some raise, some in a good large, well, not huge account, where they do teacher grants every year in collaboration with the schools. When teacher asks for this or that, they will help fund them. They recently contributed a fairly large chunk of money to Helen Haller for their summer reading program, because they were short on being able to buy books. But they probably need to be asked, and that how much, what they think they can do, and taking on a much, I think you're kind of suggesting maybe taking on a much larger fundraising role. And I can't speak for them whether that's something they want to do or not. I don't see any other members on the meeting tonight that are members of the Squam Education Foundation. I kind of serve on it, and I sit there as the school board representative, and I try to feed them information if I can. And but I'm not pushing, hey, you guys need to raise $10 million to help out the schools. They're not, they just haven't done that in the past. But yeah, that's a possibility.
Yes, it's very worthy of a conversation with them. There is a slightly different business model of how the PA Education Foundation works in the Squam. And it is very worthy of a conversation to have them at the table with us here.
I think that to speak more directly to your question, Director Alverson, I think that because just the vast majority of all revenue comes from student enrollment, it's when you consider raising money. And Director Stauffer did speak to some avenues, where we could capture, more of those earning college credit and transitional kindergarten, because those avenues do do increase enrollment. So I think those are avenues that could potentially boost revenue. And then, you know, I think of grants, but I think we already try to exhaust every option we can as far, you know, as far as I know, and Darlene can certainly speak to that, I'm sure. But and then of course lobbying our folks down in Olympia to make sure that the funding is either maintained or increased. I appreciate the conversation about the regionalization coming up, because that's something we need to have on our radar. We need, especially with the cost of housing in the Squam area, we need to make sure to let decision makers know that not only should 6% not be cut, but it should be higher in our area. So those are some things that come to mind when we think about, okay, increasing revenue from that avenue of things. So
It just,
Greg, yeah,
Eric, if I can, because I think the idea of the fundraising and the grants, I think you ought to turn over every rock. So, you know, kudos to you for turning over those rocks. One of the things you got to think about, though, and we said it several times tonight, ESSER dollars were a good and a bad story. And so what you want to make sure of is that you have a sustainable revenue source. And so these one-time revenue sources can be a Band-Aid like ESSER is, right? It's bridging the gap. But anything that you do in the future to Band-Aid it, you're going to have to go back again and you're going to have to do something else that gets you to a sustainable revenue source. And so I think you ought to turn over every stone. But really, and Eric, you said it, it's the predictable enrollment, right? Keeping kids in the system, getting more kids in the system, because that's where your revenue comes from. But being able from year to year to know what that's going to look like. And having lived in the grant world, which is what we do here for the ESDs, it feels real good when you get a grant in for $1 million or $2 million, but it also doesn't feel good in 2 years, you know, later when it goes away. And so that sustainable revenue is really what you're driving for.
Director Jeffries, I know you jumped in on the grant question, but I think you had your hand up prior to that as well.
Yeah, Greg mentioned this is a job not for the faint of heart. So, you know, we talk about our school board hats, which I contend are on 24/7, but now we're going to have to, because we're going to be out in the wind with our hat, so to speak. We're going to have to be secure, might even have to be some hard hat and strapped on a lot of really hard. So if we do our collaboration with the community, and like Greg mentioned, no matter what decision we make, we're going to have a vocal group of people that don't like it, and probably for legitimate reasons. So, you know, it's going to be not for the faint. We also talked about coming up with a plan, and hopefully through the school administration and Superintendent Zook and Superintendent Nichols, we come up with a plan and then we stick to it. Sometimes we're really good at coming up with a plan. We have the plan on paper and we show everybody the plan, and then we don't follow it. So I think over the next couple, 3-4 years, this school board and whoever is on the school board over the next 2 or 3 years, they're going to have, they're all going to be facing some really tough decisions. And like I said, I'm assuming that we're not going to have that big student increase in enrollment. So yeah, not for the faint of heart. And we have a plan and we stick to it steadfastly. Of course, it can be flexible, like somebody said, you know, budgets, make a budget today and it changes tomorrow. But at the same time, we're in a real tough situation.
Director Johnson?
I just had a question. It seems like one of our other main, or a comment in response to Director Halverson's question. It seems like one of our other main funding sources is operating levies, right? So when is the next time that we would be needing to have a vote on a levy? not sure how long our current one goes for.
I can answer that.
Mhm.
Last February of 21 is when it was approved, 5 years. And we can't adjust it. We have a thing that for our messaging, which hopefully would resonate, is that we have always gone with a lower rate. You know, we could have had it up a little higher, but we have kept it at a lower rate, so there wasn't a sticker shock to our community, and we've just maintained it at the same through the years. And so, but yeah, it's a downrange, but it is a good question to be thinking of that. Our colleagues around the state, some of them have gone for higher rates. And in this past election cycle, some of those did not pass. And then they ran it again and it still didn't pass. And they wish they would have gone at the minimum rate still. So
Okay.
That's what I was
Thanks.
gonna, when I raised my hand, was to add the, when our next levy is. Now we could go out for a transportation or a tech levy, or another cap, but those are, transportation is particular to the transportation side, the buses, and tech is to the technology of between computer, software, hardware type thing.
So I think Director Johnson's probably referring more specifically to the enrichment levy, right? Or otherwise known as, formerly known as EP&O, or yeah, all these different terms.
Yeah, you know the terminology better than I do, but I think people who aren't familiar with funding get it's easy to get confused between operating funds and construction and bonds, and what all the various types of revenue packages are that get submitted to the voters for their approval. So it's my understanding that that's like a supplemental operating funds as opposed to like a construction bond.
Right. Yeah, because we do have that capital projects levy as well, which is separate.
Right.
Can only be used for, cannot be used for these general operating expenses. And
Okay.
Larry?
I was just going to ask, or my assumption is, you guys can tell me if I'm wrong, if we did have a transportation levy or a technology levy, that would, and it passed, that would bring in money that would take pressure off of this, our expenditures and revenue side. In other words, instead of spending district money for extra technology or extra buses, new buses that we needed. For example, a transportation levy would take some of the pressure off the district, but I don't think, I'm sure we're not going to get a $4 million. It's not going to solve our $4 million problem, but it might help us out several $100,000 here and there. So I think that's on the table, at least to look at and discuss. But again, it's going to have to be a lot of community talk and collaboration, because Director Stauffer is right. We have districts around us whose EP&O levies have been failing, and they're facing huge budget cuts right now. Boom. And I've been reading about, the obvious cuts that they have to make to various programs, and it's real scary. Luckily, our community's always supported our EP&O levy, and it is one of the lower ones around. And so that's a reality we may have to take a look at.
Sorry, I just got a signal that my internet was unstable. Or y'all able to hear me still? Okay, good. I see a couple nods. Thank you. I just didn't know if either Darlene or Joan or even Greg or Monica, if y'all is that, can y'all add any particular insight that might help the board regarding levy options, since that came up as a part of this discussion?
Yeah, I don't know if I have any more insight than what Larry talked about. You know, all of those things that Larry talked about, you know, are possible. You know, you've got experience with the capital project levy, certainly. There are such things as transportation levies. That's a fact. There are technology levies. That's a fact. What you have to figure out, I think, is the community sentiment around additional tax dollars while you're trying to reduce basically staff and program. And so that's a tough balance, because your best disciples for levies are the school staff that are inside the school district. And those are the same folks that, if you wind up reducing some amount of staff, many of your voters are going to take a look at either a reduction in staff or a reduction in program as something as it's not going to be providing solid rationale to vote for additional taxes, right? So you got these multiple bad choices, and you're trying to make the best of a whole bunch of bad choices. And that's the dialogue that you have to have. And that's why surveying the community, I think, is really, really important. And so, Eric, I'm not specifically asking a question or adding more to what Larry said. All of those things are possible, but there's a lot of strategy involved. And just because it's possible may not be the thing that you've got to do under these circumstances.
Thank you. Any other questions? Dr. Alverson.
I'll just say, so along those lines, that I think it's really important that we show the community that we are good stewards of the money we already have before we ask for more money. And just that's important, that that they know that we are working hard to live within our means. And then if we do ask for more funds, it's, you know, it's more plausible. And I think people like to know what they're paying for. And so the clarity of very specific bonds and like a tech levy or whatever just seems really, makes a lot of sense to me. So, but the first point is just, we need to be good stewards. And so we have to do the hard work. And along those lines, be thinking about added streams of revenue.
Yeah, Eric, if I can, just one other point I want to make, and again, this is based upon experience, and it's just something to think about. The state every couple of years, and you may be familiar at Tom Island, does surveys for, I think it's maybe Davidson, Monica, and you can correct me in which, trying to think which lending institution is big into the survey, but there's a state survey that comes out every 3 years. And they ask questions of people in the community around what they think of their schools. And you may have seen it, you know, it's ABC grades. You can also enhance that survey by adding some additional questions based upon your fiscal situation, some of the things that we're talking about. That's a really good tool to explore. And again, the guy's name is Tom Island, and I can get you some more information. But it strikes me, based upon the really good conversation tonight and really good questions by board members, what you need is more data. You need more information. And so that will inform you as to whether or not, you know, Maren, your point, you know, is it a really good idea to go out for a levy right now for tech or whatever? But I think without having data, and COVID's changed things because people's perceptions are different. What we thought we knew 2 years ago, we no longer know. And so to establish those right questions, get baseline data, and proceed with some analytics, I think is really important.
Yeah. Also, just to add, you know, completely a different conversation, but since we're thinking about how taxes might impact our community, I still, part of the conversation is just that that conversation around an upcoming bond proposal as well, because all of that can impact our the taxes of our constituents. So it has to be part of that conversation as well. So I think Superintendent Zook last board meeting was making a strong recommendation that that's something that gets looked at. So definitely part of the conversation. Director Stoffer.
Yes, I'm reflecting back on a WASDA annual conference 2 years ago, and the keynote speaker talked about opportunities, and that COVID actually gave us a lot of opportunities and to change the lens and discussion, something that public education has been dealing with since 1912. I'm looking over at a chart that's behind my back here of everything that's on public education's plate. And we have this opportunity to really look at all of our programs and those needs. But first we need that data, that survey of our community, understanding that I'm going to go in this with opportunities and being optimistic. And there's always challenges across the board. Faced challenged in my other previous life. And so for focusing, keeping kids central for those discussions, I think we will get there, and encourage that with the community also. Thank you.
Director Jeffries.
Yeah, this really doesn't really add too much to it. I'll look at it from the other side. Director Stoffer talked about being optimistic, and I think that's good. I'm basically a pessimist. Maybe it's my science background being skeptical. I'm look at it more as a pessimistic, and then I hope to be pleasantly surprised and proven wrong. Whereas if we don't really plan carefully, we don't survey the community carefully, we don't do our due diligence, and it's going to take some hard work, we could be have the wrong color glasses on, looking at our opportunities. And I think it's going to take some really, really hard work on all our parts and the district, and getting the community involved. It's going to take some hard work there too. And I know here in Squam, I am optimistic. I know we have those people here in this community that are very capable of helping us and helping the students out, and creating a school system that Squam deserves. And so I am optimistic that the people are out there, but I'm going to basically take a pessimistic point of view, and we're going to have to really work hard to accomplish what we need to get done. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else from the board or from our guests, or Superintendent Zook or Superintendent Nichols?
I just wanted to thank you all for listening, and it's been great to hear your conversation. And I know it doesn't make you feel better, but you aren't alone in this. And we're here to help too. That's what we do. Greg told you, we're really just here to help and connect. And so if you need anything, Darlene is always, great and checks in. So thank you.
Yeah, what Monica said, ditto. And Eric, thanks for the opportunity to engage. And again, I'm not an expert. We don't pretend to be experts. We've got some opinions. We're a resource. I encourage you to use the resource. Ultimately, you're going to have to make the hard decisions. What I like about tonight, though, is the board has really asked some good questions and got some good ideas. And so I think you're well on your way, right? That's the thing, having that dialogue and the talk about collaboration and bringing the community and bringing the staff. I think that's exactly the right direction you've got to go. And I'm back to Regan again, you know, coming in as a new superintendent. I mean, she's going to need your support, and I know it's there. I can see that. It sounds like, you know, you're getting off on a really good start, Regan, in terms of the conversation. But you know, there's no substitute for good planning. I'm thankful, number one, for the opportunity, and I really appreciate tonight's dialogue. It reminds me just how difficult it is to be in a school district. And my information's been dated. I haven't been a superintendent of school district for some time. And I certainly haven't been a superintendent during COVID, nor a board member during COVID. You know, you have arrived at the pinnacle, I think, of complexity at this point. And if you can see yourselves, you know, out of the darkness into the light, after having gone through what we've gone through 2 years, the leadership change and so forth, you know, Squam School District is going to be in great hands as you move forward. It's just trying to get to that light, you know, those next couple of steps. So again, thanks for the opportunity, everybody.
Thank you for being here. Okay. And definitely some things to look at. And I love the idea of engaging with our stakeholders and making it a ongoing collaborative process for sure. Even with the toughest decision, I think that's the best way forward. So appreciate that advice. So with that, I believe that is all we have on our agenda. So thank you very much. Thank you all. And we will adjourn for the evening. Have a good night, everyone.